Welcome back. You're watching CNN and this is Connect the World with me, Linda Kincaid. Well, tensions between the US and Russia are flaring up yet again, this time over a decades-old nuclear weapons treaty. US President Donald Trump says Russia is not holding up its end of the deal. He says he's pulling the country out of the pact. Meanwhile, Russia has accused Washington of violating the agreement and has warned it could take retaliatory measures if the US makes good on its threat. Well, Pleitgen joins us now from Moscow with more on this story. And Fred, this was an agreement signed back in the 1980s. President Trump claims Russia has repeatedly violated it. What is this treaty and what happens if the US ends it?
Yeah, it's a treaty on intermediate range nuclear weapons. And you're right, it was signed in the 1980s, especially due to concerns from the Europeans, because these nuclear weapons are extremely powerful, but because they're only intermediate range, that means it doesn't take very long from the point that they're launched to the time that they strike, giving any sort of civilian population very little time to get into shelter. So it was a bit of concern in Europe at the time, and of course in Russia as well, about these weapons, and that's how this treaty initially came together. Now the U.S. believes it's no longer in its interest because it believes that the Russians have been violating it for a very long time. Here's what we learned today. The U.S. has long been accusing Russia of violating the INF Treaty by developing and deploying medium-range nuclear-capable missiles. Now President Trump says America is axing the agreement.
We're the ones that have stayed in the agreement, and we've honored the agreement, but Russia has not, unfortunately, honored the agreement. So we're going to terminate the agreement. We're going to pull out.
During his visit to Moscow in the coming days, National Security Advisor John Bolton is expected to formally tell the Russians that America is leaving the INF Treaty. INF stands for Intermediate Nuclear Forces. The treaty was signed in 1987 between the U.S. and the Soviet Union and ultimately led to almost 2,700 medium-range nuclear missiles being withdrawn. Experts saying, by and large, the agreement has worked.
It was designed to provide a measure of strategic stability on the continent of Europe by banning missiles of a range between 300 and 3,400 miles, both cruise and ballistic missiles. So it was really meant to kind of take the temperature down, and it resulted in the destruction of literally thousands of missiles, and it has been in effect ever since.
Russia denies violating the treaty and accuses the U.S. of breaching it by developing anti-missile systems. Vladimir Putin recently making what some felt were troubling remarks about possible nuclear warfare.
In this situation, we kind of expect that someone will use nuclear weapons against us. We do not do anything ourselves. Well, yes, but then the aggressor should still know that vengeance is inevitable, that he will be destroyed. And we are the victims of aggression, and as martyrs, we will go to heaven, and they will simply die.
The U.S. also believes the INF Treaty puts it at a disadvantage versus a resurgent China, which is not part of the agreement. Another reason the administration says to pull out of the deal. So you can feel there, Linda, the tensions between the U.S. and Russia really ratcheting up once again in the wake of all of this, and of course with all the other things that have been going on in that relationship basically since 2016. And we do have National Security Advisor John Bolton in Russia the next couple of days with some very top-level meetings, but I think it's safe to say he's not going to get the warmest of welcomes from the Russians, Linda.
Yeah, I can't expect he'll get a very warm welcome, given what's been said over the past days. But just give us a sense of Russia's take, because Russia says they haven't had this officially in writing at all. Do they believe this is just a threat, a way to get them to a negotiating table?
Yeah, that is really the big question. And I think the Russians at this point in time aren't really clear on what exactly all of this means, because you heard from President Trump his statement. There really wasn't any clarification about whether or not this means that the U.S. has made a final decision and it's out of the agreement, or whether or not there might still be some sort of wiggle room to maybe salvage this deal. And it's interesting when you look at some of the things that top-level Russian politicians have said over the course of the day, a lot of them denouncing all this, saying this could have catastrophic consequences, but all of them saying, look, we don't know whether or not the U.S. makes this as a final decision or whether or not there could still be the possibility to maybe do some sort of negotiation about all this. And that's one of the things that the Kremlin, which came out today, said as well. They said, look, we will want an explanation from John Bolton when he's here in Moscow. And I guess in the next couple of days, we are going to know more. And I think a lot of that is going to determine a lot about how the relations between the U.S. and Russia are going to move forward, Linda.
That will be a busy few days for John Bolton. Frederick Pleitgen, always good to have you with us. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Well, let's get some more analysis on this. I want to bring in Leslie Vinjamuri. She is the head of the U.S. and the Americas program at Chatham House and joins us now from London. Good to have you with us.
Thank you.
This obviously isn't the first time we've heard about Russia violating this treaty. CNN reported back as recently as 2014 that the US had accused Russia of violating it and that it had alerted NATO, but only recently had NATO confirmed that. And this is far from the first time that Donald Trump was pulled out of an international treaty. So is this a bluff, or do you think this is just his way of renegotiating?
Well, it's not the first time that Trump was pulled out of a treaty, but remember that Trump has had a very different position on Russia than he has with respect to a number of other issues. What the real game changer here, I think, is John Bolton, who clearly has for a very long time opposed arms control deals, doesn't like cooperation, cooperative deals in general, and certainly has been opposed to this particular deal since at least 2011, probably longer. So that's the game changer on this dimension. And it's the thing that's also likely to send a signal that it is real and not a bluff for those who've been watching this administration very carefully and who have been watching John Bolton for a very long time.
So what are the risks here if the U.S. does simply rip it up? Could this spark an arms race?
Yeah, and this is, the critical question. What's the best way to deal with what have been violations of the treaty that President Obama called out as early as 2014, testing, and again, deployment in 2017. Obama called that out again. But is the best mechanism to stay in the treaty, to continue that cooperation, to continue a program or to accelerate a program of pressure of perhaps America investing in its own research and its own weapons development on this dimension, or is it to simply abandon the treaty? And the risk here, of course, is first of all, the optics are terrible. America once again walking away from a very significant agreement, which, despite the claims that Russia hasn't been complying, has nonetheless produced a great degree of stability over a very long period of time. And if you think, what is the signal that sends, and what are the consequences likely to be? It's hard to make the case that this puts America, Russia, or the rest of the world in a better position if the goal is stability, especially on this question of nuclear arms.
Absolutely. And Donald Trump is certainly not afraid to walk away from any international agreement, as he has done so in the past. But China is not part of this treaty and therefore doesn't face any of the sort of constraints developing new intermediate range missiles. In fact, the U.S. Pacific Command said 95% of the missiles China's developing would violate this treaty if they were a part of it. What do you think is going to bring Russia and China to the table here?
Yeah, so there is a real question about whether the broader thinking on pulling out of this treaty is driven by a number of hawks who would like America to take a much more aggressive line when it comes to deterrence in the South China Seas and in responding to what's perceived as a very significant threat from China, and having America in a deal that restricts its ability to invest in intermediate range forces, and China not in that deal is something that is seen as a concern. But again, you have to ask the question, is the decision to pull out likely to produce a better effect? And if it leads to a situation where the United States begins to invest and to build its forces, this is likely to trigger a whole series of dynamics to make other powers more insecure, to invest more. The implications, the potential consequences for an arms race are of course, very significant, not only with respect to Russia, but with respect to China and beyond. So it's a decision that shouldn't be taken lightly, that should be thought through very strategically. And I think the concern in this particular context and with respect to this particular administration is that those decisions aren't being fully vetted, not only within the administration, but across the range of very serious experts, of which there are many in the United States and in Europe. And remember, the final thing, I think, or a very significant thing to remember, is that this once again draws a line right between the United States and its European NATO allies which are very much opposed to this particular decision.
So what does Russia want here? Because it seems like Russia believes this is not any sort of official statement or move on this. They seem to think that this is a threat, but they have vowed retaliation if it goes ahead. What could that mean?
Yeah, no, undoubtedly Russia will see this as threatening. It will increase a sense of insecurity, but it also puts Russia in the position where it has no reason to, assuming that it does have an interest in developing its capacity and deploying intermediate range forces, it has now no longer has a reason to hide that factor, to hold back, right? Even if it has been violating the terms of the treaty, there's an argument that the treaty has still exercised a very significant degree of restraint over Russia. That, if you take that away, then the consequences are likely to be very real, especially if it feels that America is now going to get into this game. And so you can see the risk that insecurity accelerates and drives further competition, which won't be productive or stabilizing.
Absolutely. Leslie Vinjamuri, good to get your analysis and perspective, head of the U.S. The Americas program at Chatham House. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, live from Atlanta, this is Connect the World. Coming up, migrants on the move at the Mexico-Guatemala border. We're going to have a live report when we come back.